into it now. Page one, legalized marijuana and hemp and CBD oil. And really, like we kind of kicked this off with, this is a growing industry of high risk customers. So in other words, the expectation is going to be that you have specialized policies and procedures for any of these higher risk customers that you might be doing business with. Now, it's a growing industry. Like I said, in fact, the majority of states have legalized cannabis in some circumstance or another. 37 states out there, including the District of Columbia and Guam and Puerto Rico, have legalized it at least for medical use or for some purpose. 21 states have approved marijuana for recreational use. So we're getting to the point where it is a very common issue. And maybe you are in one of those states where it has been legalized for recreational use, or maybe you're in a state that borders one of those states. However, it is getting to be more and more of an issue. It is a growing industry of businesses and individuals, and they are there's an increasing demand for banking services. So part of the problem here is that there is a very broad definition for what is a marijuana-related business. So it is not just the companies or the individuals that are dispensing marijuana or selling it or processing it or whatever the case may be. It's not just those that are actively handling the product. A marijuana-related business includes anyone who is receiving the funds derived from the sale of marijuana. So we'll talk about the marijuana-related business definition in more depth, but just keep in mind that this is much bigger than just talking about those that are actively involved in the industry. Also, number three, as you're kind of flipping through the materials, there's a wide variety of products that are out there, and it gets increasingly difficult to tell, okay, what type of product. This company is selling a certain type of product, but I can't really nail down, okay, is this a marijuana product? Is this a hemp product? Is this CBD oil? We're going to go through some of those definitions to make sure that we're all on the same page of what those variations are and what that means for your program if you have a customer that's involved in any of those types of activities. Now, again, we are in a situation where there is some ambiguity around, okay, is this a legal industry or not? And we're going to go through a lot of different topics or a lot of different sources of law. We're going to start with the Controlled Substances Act because that's the federal law that really defines whether or not a product is illegal from a cannabis perspective. Then we're going to talk about the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018. That's the act that really kind of carved off hemp-related businesses or hemp from the definition of marijuana, and we'll talk about how that all works. And then we're going to go into agency guidance. And unfortunately, we've actually got a lot of agencies that we're going to need to pay attention to. We're going to talk about Department of Justice guidance. We're going to talk about the Department of Agriculture and what their guidance says. We're going to talk about what the Treasury and FinCEN has to say about this issue. But from what you can see is we have conflicting laws. We have different sources of guidance from different agencies, and they all have to play together for us to get an understanding of what we are supposed to do as an industry. And then number 4 at the bottom of the page, as you're kind of flipping through, there's the obvious one. There are conflicting state laws that we also need to be aware of. What states are you in? What do the laws require in all of those states? I mean, is it legal in your state for recreational use? Is it legal in your state for medical use? How does that all work? And then with any customer that you have, how do you evaluate whether or not that's high risk or not? So unfortunately, whether or not this activity or this customer, what they're doing, the question of whether or not it's legal, it kind of depends on where you are and what jurisdictions you're operating in. What the product is, what they're actually dabbling in, or what the product actually is from a legal perspective, and then what is that product being used for. All of those can weigh in on whether or not this is lawful activity. And even then, remember, there's this overarching idea that if it's defined as marijuana, it still is probably illegal from a federal perspective. Now, let's pause here and think, okay, we've got this growing industry that's out there. We have a lot of these dispensaries and a lot of these products that are out there. What's the big deal? Why can't we just ignore it and kind of let them operate outside of our financial industry in general? Well, when this was first becoming a thing, I actually went on a trip and I was out in Oregon right after Oregon was kind of on the front end of legalizing recreational use for marijuana. And while I was out there visiting, it was back in a time, and I haven't been there in a few years, but at the time, I mean, you couldn't throw a rock without hitting a cannabis dispensary of some sort, whether it was a brick and mortar building, whether it was a truck where somebody was selling out the back. There were all kinds of these dispensaries that were out there, and they were having a lot of difficulty getting a bank or a credit union or someone to bank their business. And so what was happening is a lot of these dispensaries, they were actually getting all of their funds. It's a very cash heavy business. They were taking all the cash and they were actually storing it in, traditional storage units. So you had cash being warehoused from these cash intensive business, and they actually had to hire private security forces to guard that cash that they had. So you can imagine that's if you're in a small community and you have cannabis dispensaries that are warehousing cash in your backyard and they have private security forces guarding that, it's a little bit high risk, and unfortunately it does create a lot of concern for the average people. And then also from our industry's perspective, last thing we want is warehoused cash in our backyard. So there has been a push to try to get some level of legitimacy to this industry so they can actually get banking services. So, but the key is to understand, okay, what is the risk? What is the customer that we're dealing with? And then what is our risk tolerance as a financial institution? What are we willing to allow, and what are we going to say, okay, that's too far, too high risk for us? And really, to even get to that point, you have to understand some of these concepts that we're going to get into.